The view from the 45th floor of the Hudson Yards penthouse was supposed to be a testament to a life built on trust and shared ambition, until a single misdirected email turned the city lights into a blur of mockery. It wasn't just that Sarah was sleeping with Julian. It was that they were laughing about how easy it was to keep Ethan in the dark while using his connections to float their failing agency. But in the world of venture capital, information is leverage, and betrayal is just a debt that needs to be collected with interest. If you enjoy stories where the heartbreak is quiet, but the revenge is deafening, stay with me, because the board meeting is about to begin. The rain in Manhattan didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker, reflecting the neon bleed of the city lights. Ethan Caldwell stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his Tribeca penthouse, a tumbler of single malt scotch resting heavily in his hand. The amber liquid was the only warmth in the room. Behind him, on the sprawling mahogany desk, lay a stack of documents bound in a nondescript beige folder. It was labeled simply, Project S&F, Due Diligence. To the outside world, Ethan was a ghost in the machine of high finance, a man who moved capital like a grandmaster moves pawns, silent and lethal. Tonight, however, the numbers on the pages didn't represent profit margins or EBITDA. They represented the disintegration of his life. He turned away from the window and walked back to the desk. He didn't need to open the folder again. The images were burned into his retinas. Page 12 wasn't a balance sheet. It was a surveillance photo taken by the private investigator his firm used for background checks on potential acquisitions. It showed Julian Thorne, the charismatic, failing CEO of Sterling & Finch, with his hand resting possessively on the lower back of a woman in a trench coat. They were entering the elevators of the Crosby Street Hotel at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. The woman was Sarah. His Sarah. The sound of the front door unlocking cut through the silence like a gunshot. Ethan didn't jump. He took a slow sip of the scotch, feeling the burn settle in his chest, numbing the jagged edges of his heart. "Ethan, are you up?" Her voice was melodic, tired, practiced. He heard the click of her heels on the marble foyer, then the soft thud of her bag being dropped on the bench. "In the study," Ethan replied. His voice was steady, terrifyingly steady. Sarah appeared in the doorway a moment later. She looked impeccable, even after a 14-hour day. Her blonde hair was swept back, her lipstick slightly faded, but still present. She offered him a weary, apologetic smile, the same smile she had worn at their wedding 3 years ago. "I am so sorry," she sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "Julian kept us late again. The pitch for the energetic drink account is a nightmare. He needed me to go over the storyboards one last time." "The storyboards," Ethan repeated, his eyes locking onto hers. He looked for a flinch, a tremor, a sign of guilt. There was nothing but practiced exhaustion. "It's late, Sarah. It's almost 1 a.m. "I know." She walked over, placing a cold hand on his arm. She smelled of rain and a faint woody cologne that wasn't his. "I tried to leave, but you know how Julian gets. He's, intense about the creative process. He sounds demanding. He's under a lot of pressure." Sarah defended him instinctively, then caught herself. "The agency is struggling, Ethan. He thinks this account will save us." Ethan looked down at her hand on his arm. He remembered the photo in the folder, Julian's hand on her back. The symmetry was nauseating. "Is it?" Ethan asked softly. "Saving the agency?" "We hope so," she said, leaning up to kiss his cheek. It was a dry, perfunctory peck. "I'm going to shower. I feel like I've been running a marathon." "Go ahead," he said. He watched her leave the room, listening as her footsteps faded down the hallway. A moment later, the hiss of the shower started. Ethan set his glass down on a coaster. He sat in his leather chair, the leather creaking in the quiet room. He opened the folder again, bypassing the photos this time, and flipping to the legal addendum at the back. Sterling and Finch was hemorrhaging money. They were leveraged to the hilt, and the bank was threatening to call the loan. Julian was desperate. He was looking for a silent investor, someone to inject cash without asking questions, someone to keep the lights on so he could keep playing CEO. Sarah thought she was protecting her lover's secret failure. She didn't know that Julian had unknowingly shopped the debt to Obsidian Holdings, Ethan's shell corporation. Ethan uncapped his fountain pen. The nib hovered over the signature line of the acquisition contract. Buying the company was a terrible financial decision. The assets were toxic, the leadership was incompetent, and the market share was dwindling. In any other scenario, Ethan would have shredded the proposal. But this wasn't business. This was the only way to keep them in the room. If he divorced her now, she would leave, disappear into Julian's arms, and rewrite history to make herself the victim. No. Ethan signed his name with a flourish. The black ink glistened in the lamplight. He wasn't going to leave her. He was going to buy her world. He closed the folder, picked up his phone, and sent a single text to his lawyer. Execute the buy order at opening bell. Full control. I want the chair. As the shower turned off in the master bath, Ethan stared at the rain-streaked window. He was no longer just a husband. He was the boss. And performance reviews started Monday. The weekend arrived with a suffocating brightness. Sunlight poured into the living room of the penthouse, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, tiny, suspended particles that felt like the only things moving in the stagnant atmosphere of their marriage. Ethan sat at the dining table, a stark slab of black marble surrounded by 3 monitors he had set up early that morning. He was on a conference call with his legal team, his AirPods in, his voice low and devoid of inflection. To an observer, he was simply working a deal. To Ethan, he was digging a grave. The wire transfer is queued, Mr. Caldwell. The lawyer's voice crackled in his ear. We have the countersigned offer from the board of Sterling and Finch. They were enthusiastic. They didn't expect a cash offer at this valuation. Desperation inflates gratitude, Ethan murmured, his eyes fixed on the hallway leading to the bedroom. Sarah emerged a moment later. She wasn't wearing her usual weekend loungewear. Instead, she was dressed in a silk blouse and a pencil skirt that hugged her frame, an outfit designed to impress or seduce. She was fastening a pearl earring, her reflection caught in the hallway mirror. Ethan watched her over the rim of his coffee mug. He knew that look. It was the frantic grooming of a woman trying to hold on to youth, trying to be someone else's fantasy. Work on a Saturday? Ethan asked, removing one AirPod. Sarah jumped slightly, her hand hovering over her earlobe. She turned to him, her smile tight. I know, it's awful. Julian called an emergency strategy session for the beverage account. He says we're losing the narrative. The narrative is important, Ethan said, typing a command into the terminal on his center screen. The code for the shell company, Obsidian Holdings, blinked green. You look very elegant for a strategy session. Sarah smoothed her skirt, a flicker of unease passing through her eyes before she buried it under a layer of practiced casualness. Precise appearances, Ethan. You know how clients are. We might have a video conference with the brand reps. I see. She walked over to him, the scent of jasmine and lying filling his personal space. She placed a hand on his shoulder, leaning down to look at his screens. He minimized the wire transfer window just in time, leaving only a generic Bloomberg terminal visible. "Don't work too hard," she whispered, kissing the top of his head. It felt like a brand, a searing reminder of her duplicity. "I'll try to be back for dinner. Don't wait up if I'm late." "I won't," Ethan replied. "I have some closing to do myself." He watched her walk to the private elevator. She checked her phone twice before the doors even opened. He saw the light of the screen illuminate her face, a soft, eager glow that she never showed him anymore. The elevator chimed, the doors slid open, and she stepped into the steel box, disappearing from his life for the afternoon to be with Julian. The apartment fell silent again. Ethan put the AirPod back in. "Are we ready?" "Yes, sir. The board has approved the sale. As of this execution, Obsidian Holdings will possess 51% of the voting shares. You have full controlling interest." Ethan looked at the empty space where his wife had just stood. She was going to Julian to complain about her boring husband, to laugh about their secret, to feel the thrill of the illicit. She had no idea that while she was unbuttoning her blouse in a hotel room, her husband was buying the very bed she laid on. "Executed," Ethan said. He hit the return key. On the screen, a progress bar filled rapidly from left to right. Transfer complete. The phone on the table buzzed. It was an automated alert from his bank, confirming the 8-figure deduction. He was poorer in liquidity, but rich in power. Ethan stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the sprawl of Manhattan. Somewhere out there, in a boutique office in Soho or a hotel in Midtown, Julian Thorne was celebrating his survival, thinking a mysterious angel investor had just saved his company. Ethan took a sip of his cold coffee. Monday morning was going to be very interesting. Monday morning at Sterling and Finch buzzed with a nervous, electric energy. The agency's main conference room was a glass-walled fishbowl suspended above the hustle of Soho. Inside, 20 senior staff members sat around a reclaimed wood table waiting. Julian Thorne stood at the head of the table, looking like a man who had just cheated death. He wore a navy suit that cost more than the average car, his hair perfectly coiffed. He was radiating the arrogance of survival. Sarah sat to his right, her hands clasped on top of her notebook. She caught Julian's eye for a split second, a micro-expression of shared relief. They had done it. The mysterious Obsidian Holdings had wired the funds. The bankruptcy was off the table. Their playground was safe. "Everyone settle down," Julian said, clapping his hands together. "As you know, today marks a new chapter. We have secured a strategic partnership that will allow Sterling and Finch to not only survive but dominate. The new ownership prefers to remain silent, but their representative is here to facilitate the transition." The double doors at the far end of the room opened. The room went silent, expecting a lawyer in a gray suit or perhaps a faceless accountant. Instead, 2 paralegals walked in, placing thick binders at every seat. They were followed by a senior attorney from a top corporate firm. And then, walking in last, with the casual indifference of a predator entering a grazing field, was Ethan. The air left the room. Sarah's pen slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the wooden table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the sudden vacuum of silence. She stared at her husband, her mouth parting slightly, her mind failing to bridge the gap between Ethan, the boring finance husband, and the investor. Julian froze. His charming smile curdled into a mask of confusion. "Ethan? What are you? Is Sarah okay?" He assumed Ethan was there for a family emergency. It was the only logic his brain could process. Ethan didn't look at Sarah. He walked past her chair, the scent of his cologne, cold, crisp, expensive, trailing behind him. He took the empty seat at the opposite end of the table, facing Julian directly. "Sarah is fine, Julian," Ethan said. His voice was calm, projecting effortlessly to the corners of the room. "Please, sit down." Julian didn't move. "I don't understand. We're waiting for the chairman of Obsidian Holdings." "You're speaking to him," Ethan replied. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The staff looked from Julian to Ethan, sensing a shift in gravity but not understanding the source. Ethan unbuttoned his suit jacket and sat, placing a single folder on the table. "I am the sole proprietor of Obsidian Holdings, which means, as of 9 a.m. this morning, I own Sterling and Finch." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands began to tremble under the table. She looked at Julian, begging him to do something, to fix this, but Julian looked small. He looked terrified. "I've reviewed the financials," Ethan continued, ignoring the shockwaves radiating from his wife. "And I've reviewed the operational extravagances. There will be changes, immediate changes." "Ethan," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ethan finally turned his gaze to her. It wasn't the warm look of a husband. It was the dissecting stare of an auditor finding a discrepancy. "I prefer to keep my business and personal lives separate, Sarah," he said, the double meaning slicing through the air like a razor. "Unlike some people in this room." He turned back to the group. "Julian, take your seat," Ethan commanded, his voice hardening. "You are no longer the CEO. You are now the Chief Creative Officer, reporting directly to me. I will be assuming the role of acting CEO effective immediately." Julian sank into his chair, stripped of his title and his dignity in under 60 seconds. "Open your binders," Ethan said. "Let's see if the reality matches the pitch." Sarah opened the binder with shaking fingers. She couldn't read the words. All she could feel was the weight of Ethan's presence at the other end of the table, a heavy, suffocating pressure. He knew. She didn't know how or how much, but looking at the cold set of his jaw, she realized the man she had cheated on was gone. The man sitting there now owned them. The conference room air conditioner hummed with a low, aggressive drone, but it did nothing to cool the sweat gathering at the nape of Sarah's neck. It was Thursday, 3 days into the new regime, and the atmosphere at Sterling and Finch had shifted from panic to a terrified silence. Sarah stood at the head of the room, the projector screen behind her illuminating the dark space with high-contrast images of the agency's biggest account, Velour, a luxury lingerie brand. "The concept is hidden desires," Sarah said, her voice steady but lacking its usual magnetic cadence. She clicked the remote, changing the slide to a mood board featuring shadowy hotel hallways, discarded silk, and stolen glances. It was a campaign she and Julian had brainstormed over wine in a suite at the Pierre, a campaign born directly from their affair. It's about the thrill of the secret, the idea that what we hide is more valuable than what we show. She dared to glance at the end of the table. Ethan sat in the ergonomically meshed chair that used to belong to Julian. He was reading a file on his tablet, barely looking at the screen. Julian sat 2 seats down, looking pale and diminished, tapping his pen nervously against a notepad. "Is that it?" Ethan asked, not looking up. "That's the core concept, yes," Sarah replied, gripping the remote tighter. "We believe the demographic responds to mystery." Ethan finally looked up. His eyes were devoid of the warmth she used to see over breakfast. They were the eyes of a surgeon looking at a tumor. "Mystery," Ethan repeated, tasting the word like sour milk. It looks cheap, Sarah. The room went deathly quiet. The junior copywriters stared at their laps. Julian opened his mouth to object, but Ethan raised a single finger, silencing him without breaking eye contact with his wife. It looks like a transaction, Ethan continued, his voice calm and lethal. You're selling romance, but this imagery? This suggests a one-night stand in a budget hotel. It lacks commitment. It lacks the weight of consequence. It's modern, Sarah defended, though her voice wavered. It's about living in the moment. It's about impulsive gratification, Ethan corrected. He stood up and walked toward the screen, his shadow falling over the images of the lovers. He tapped the screen where a man's hand was shown slipping a strap off a shoulder. This isn't love, Sarah. This is just appetite. Velour is a legacy brand. They sell permanence. You're selling them a mistake. He turned to the room, addressing the team but speaking only to her. The problem with secrets, Sarah, is that they aren't valuable. They're just liabilities waiting to be exposed. When you build a brand on deception, you don't get loyalty. You get volatility. Sarah felt a wave of nausea. He wasn't talking about the lingerie anymore. He was dissecting their marriage, dissecting her betrayal, right there in front of her staff, using corporate buzzwords as knives. Julian, Ethan said, pivoting to the former CEO. You approved this? I thought it had an edge, Julian stammered, his charisma evaporating under Ethan's scrutiny. It has an edge, all right. The edge of a cliff, Ethan said. Scrap it. But the client presentation is on Monday, Sarah protested, desperation creeping in. We've spent 6 weeks on this. Direction. Then you have a busy weekend ahead of you, Ethan said, checking his watch. I want a new concept on my desk by 8 a.m. Monday. Something honest, something that understands the value of loyalty. He gathered his tablet and walked toward the door. As he passed Sarah, he paused, leaning in just close enough that only she could hear. Don't worry about dinner tonight, he whispered. I'll order in. You'll need to stay here until you get it right. He walked out, leaving the door open. Sarah stood frozen in the beam of the projector, the light blinding her. She looked at Julian, hoping for support, for anger, for anything. But Julian just stared at the table, refusing to meet her eyes, terrified of the man who signed his paychecks. Sarah realized then that she wasn't just an employee. She was a prisoner in the office she used to love, forced to rewrite the story of her own guilt until her husband was satisfied. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, depositing Sarah into the foyer of the penthouse. It was past midnight. The apartment was submerged in shadow, save for the glow of the wine fridge in the kitchen and the city lights bleeding through the glass walls. She expected Ethan to be asleep. She hoped he was. But as she rounded the corner into the living area, she saw the silhouette of him sitting on the sofa, a book in his lap. He hadn't turned on a single lamp. He was sitting in the dark, waiting. Sarah felt a spike of adrenaline. Fight or flight. She was exhausted, humiliated, and stripped raw by 48 hours of redoing a campaign she knew was already good enough. She couldn't take another day of his polite, public dissection of her character. I'm done, she said, her voice loud in the quiet room. She dropped her bag on the floor, not caring that it tipped over, spilling a tube of lipstick onto the hardwood. Ethan closed his book slowly, marking the page with a leather slip. You're home late. I'm not talking about the night, Ethan. I'm talking about the job. I quit. She walked toward him, fueled by a sudden, desperate bravery. I can't work for you. I won't. You're using the company to punish me for whatever you think is happening. I'll send my resignation letter in the morning." Ethan didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. He simply reached for a file resting on the coffee table, another one of those beige folders that had become the defining objects of her life. "You might want to review your employment contract before you draft that letter," Ethan said calmly. "I know my contract. 2 weeks' notice." "That was your contract with Julian," Ethan corrected. "When Obsidian Holdings acquired the assets, we also enforced the legacy clauses regarding key executives, specifically the non-compete and the retention bonus clawbacks." Sarah stopped halfway to the kitchen. "What are you talking about?" "If you resign without cause, within the first 24 months of an acquisition," Ethan recited from memory, his tone flat, "you are barred from working in any advertising, marketing, or media agency within the tri-state area for 3 years. Furthermore, the loan Sterling and Finch took out against its executive equity pool? That becomes due immediately. Your share of that debt is roughly $400,000. Sarah stared at him. The silence of the room seemed to press against her eardrums. "You can't be serious," she whispered. "You're my husband." "I am the chairman of the board," Ethan said, finally looking at her. In the shadows, his face was unreadable, a mask of stone. "And you are a liability I am trying to rehabilitate. You don't have $400,000, Sarah. You spent your savings on that apartment for your mother in Florida. And we both know Julian doesn't have it." The mention of Julian, and the subtle implication that Ethan knew Julian couldn't save her, sucked the air out of her lungs. "So I'm what?" she asked, her voice trembling with tears she refused to shed. "A slave? I just have to go in there every day and let you tear me apart?" "You have to go in there and do your job," Ethan said. "You wanted to be a creative leader. I'm giving you the structure you lacked. You should be thanking me." He stood up then, the movement sudden and fluid. He walked past her toward the bedroom, pausing only for a second. "The new campaign concept is due at 8 a.m. I suggest you get some sleep." Sarah stood alone in the dark living room. She looked at the city lights, millions of people, millions of escapes, and she was trapped in the one glass box she couldn't break. She realized then that Ethan hadn't just bought a company. He had bought her. She walked into the bedroom 10 minutes later. Ethan was already in bed, lying on his side, breathing evenly. She climbed in on her side, pulling the duvet up to her chin. The space between them was less than a foot, but it felt like an ocean of ice. She lay there, eyes open, listening to the man she had betrayed, breathe in the rhythm of a captor who knows the prisoner has nowhere to run. 2 weeks under Ethan's reign felt like 2 decades. The office, once a playground of creative chaos, had been sterilized into a machine of efficiency. The fun was gone. The casual drinking at lunch was gone. And for Sarah, the stolen glances with Julian across the hallway had been replaced by a sickening sense of dread. It was Tuesday afternoon when Julian cornered her. He pulled her into the server room, the only place in the building without glass walls, the only place Ethan's gaze couldn't physically reach. Sarah leaned against the cooling racks, crossing her arms. She looked tired. The stress of the domestic Cold War at home and the performance reviews at work had left dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. "We have to do something, Sarah," Julian hissed, his voice trembling. He looked unwashed, his hair lacking its usual sheen. "He's auditing the expense accounts from last year. The client dinners we expensed, the weekends in the Hamptons, he's going to find them." "He probably already has," Sarah said dully. He owns the company, Julian. He owns the data. That's why you need to talk to him, Julian said, stepping closer, invading her space not with desire, but with desperation. You need to smooth this over. Tell him it was industry standard. Tell him it was necessary for client retention. Sarah frowned, pulling back slightly. You want me to lie to him? Again? Do you know what it's like at home right now? We don't speak. He looks through me like I'm a piece of furniture he regrets buying. He's your husband, Julian pressed, grabbing her hand. His palms were clammy. He still loves you. I see the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. Use that. Soften him up. Maybe tonight, you cook dinner. You remind him of the good times. Get him to drop the audit. Sarah stared at his hand gripping hers. For months, she had craved his touch. She had thought it was electric, passionate. Now, in the harsh fluorescent light of the server room, it just felt weak. Are you asking me to seduce my husband to save your job? Sarah asked, her voice quiet, dangerous. Julian blinked, realizing his mistake too late. No, baby. I'm asking you to save us. If he finds the embezzlement, the discrepancies, he'll fire me for cause. He'll sue me. I'll lose everything. You mean you will lose everything, Sarah corrected. We're in this together, Julian pleaded, squeezing her hand harder. Remember? You and me against the world. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since the affair began. She didn't see the dashing, misunderstood artist anymore. She saw a man who was terrified of consequences, a man who was willing to hide behind a woman's skirt to protect his bank account. She thought of Ethan, who had discovered the betrayal and hadn't screamed, hadn't begged, hadn't collapsed. He had simply conquered. He was cruel, yes, he was vindictive, but he was strong. He had bought an entire company just to control the narrative. There was a terrifying integrity to his wrath. Julian was just pathetic. Sarah yanked her hand away as if she had touched something hot. Don't call me baby, she said, her voice ice cold. Sarah. You're on your own, Julian, she said, stepping around him. If he audits you, handle it like a CEO, or at least like a man. She opened the door and walked out into the hallway. The air outside felt cleaner. Her heart was breaking, not because she missed Julian, but because she realized how cheaply she had sold herself. She had wrecked a marriage to a titan for a fling with a coward. As she walked back to her desk, she saw Ethan's office door open. He was standing there, reviewing a document with the CFO. He looked up, his eyes locking onto hers across the bullpen. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just watched her, steady and unyielding. For the first time in months, Sarah didn't look away. She held his gaze, feeling a strange, twisted respect rising in her chest. She had feared his anger, but now, seeing Julian's weakness, she feared losing Ethan's respect even more. And she suspected she already had. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a sea of black tuxedos and designer silk, smelling of expensive perfume and ambitious conversation. It was the annual Advertising Council Gala, the night where the industry patted itself on the back for another year of selling dreams. Ethan Caldwell moved through the crowd like a shark in a reef, precise and terrifyingly calm. He wore a bespoke tuxedo that fit him like armor. On his arm was Sarah, dressed in an emerald gown that Ethan had selected for her. She looked stunning, a perfect complement to his power, but her smile was brittle. She was performing the role of the dutiful wife, shaking hands with partners who congratulated Ethan on the bold acquisition. "Smile, Sarah," Ethan murmured as they accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray. "The board members are watching." "I am smiling," Sarah replied through gritted teeth. Her eyes scanned the room, not for potential clients, but for Julian. She hadn't seen him all day. He hadn't shown up to the office. She found him near the open bar. Julian was leaning heavily against a marble pillar, a tumbler of scotch in his hand. Clearly not his first. His bow tie was slightly askew, a subtle but screaming imperfection in a room of perfectionists. He was watching them, watching Ethan's hand on the small of Sarah's back. "Ignore him," Ethan said, sensing her tension without even looking. "He looks unstable," Sarah whispered. "He looks finished," Ethan corrected. Before they could turn away, Julian pushed off the pillar and stumbled toward them. The crowd parted instinctively, sensing the volatility radiating from him. The murmur of conversation around them died down, replaced by the watchful silence of 1,000 people hungry for a scandal. "The happy couple," Julian announced, his voice too loud, slurring slightly. He halted a few feet in front of them, swaying. "The banker and the muse." Ethan didn't flinch. He took a sip of his champagne, looking at Julian with an expression of mild boredom. "You've had enough, Julian. I'll have security call you a car." "I don't need a car," Julian snapped, spilling a drop of amber liquid onto his white shirt. "I need my company back. I need credit." "You think you can just buy everything? You think writing a check makes you a creative genius?" He turned his bleary eyes to Sarah, looking for an ally. "Tell him, Sarah. Tell him about the nights we spent building. Sterling and Finch. Tell him who really understands you." The room was deadly silent now. All eyes were on Sarah. This was the moment, the mini high point, where the secret threatened to spill onto the ballroom floor. Sarah looked at Julian. In her memory, he was a dashing visionary who whispered poetry in bed. In reality, standing under the crystal chandeliers, he was a messy, bitter drunk, trying to drag her down with him. He wasn't fighting for her love. He was fighting for his ego. She felt a wave of revulsion so strong it made her dizzy. "Julian," Sarah said, her voice clear and cold, "you're embarrassing yourself." Julian recoiled as if she had slapped him. "Sarah?" "Go home," she said. "Please." Julian's face crumbled. He looked from Sarah to Ethan, finally seeing the wall of unity they presented. It was a fake unity, bought and paid for, but it was impenetrable. Ethan took a step forward, closing the distance. He didn't raise his voice. He lowered it, forcing Julian to lean in, forcing the surrounding guests to strain their ears. "You have until 9 a.m. tomorrow to clear out your desk," Ethan said softly. "If you make another scene, I won't just fire you. I'll release the audit of your expense reports to the press. You'll never work in this city again." He stared at Julian until the other man broke eye contact. Julian looked down at his shoes, defeated. Without another word, he turned and wove his way unsteadily toward the exit, a lonely figure dissolving into the shadows. Ethan adjusted his cuffs. He turned to the group of onlookers who were pretending not to stare. "Apologies," Ethan said charmingly. "Creative types, so passionate." A ripple of polite laughter moved through the group. The tension broke. The band started playing again. Ethan placed his hand back on Sarah's waist. He leaned close to her ear. "You handled that well?" he said. Sarah didn't answer. She watched the door where Julian had vanished. She realized with a hollow ache that Ethan had just saved her reputation from the very man she had loved. He had protected the Caldwell brand, and by extension her. But as the music swelled, She felt colder than she had ever felt in her life. The morning sun hit the glass walls of Sterling and Finch differently today. It felt sharper, exposing the dust on the empty desks. The office was quiet, quieter than usual. Sarah walked into Ethan's office, formerly Julian's office, carrying 2 coffees. It was a peace offering, a ritual she was trying to re-establish. Since the gala, a strange calm had settled over their lives. Julian was gone, erased from the industry just as Ethan had promised. The threat was neutralized. Sarah believed, perhaps naively, that the punishment phase was ending and the rebuilding phase was beginning. She found Ethan standing by the window, looking down at the traffic on Broadway. There were no files on his desk today. Just a single, thick envelope and a cardboard box containing his personal effects, a fountain pen, a framed photo of his parents, a crystal paperweight. "Good morning," Sarah said, placing the coffee on the desk. "I saw the press release. The trade magazines are calling you a visionary for the turnaround." Ethan turned around. He looked immaculate, as always, but there was a finality in his posture that made Sarah's stomach tighten. "The turnaround is complete," Ethan said. "I sold the agency this morning." Sarah froze. "You sold it? To whom?" "Omnicom. They've been trying to acquire a boutique firm for the youth demographic for years. I bundled the new assets, cleaned up the balance sheet, and sold it for a 40% profit." "But," Sarah stammered, "what about us? What about my job?" "Your job is secure. It was part of the deal terms. You stay on as creative director for at least 12 months. You're safe, Sarah." He walked over to the desk and picked up the envelope. He didn't offer it to her. He laid it gently on the edge of the desk, sliding it across the polished wood until it stopped in front of her. "What is this?" she asked, though deep down she knew. "I bought the company because I needed to control the variables," Ethan said quietly. "I needed to see if it was the man that attracted you, or the power. I needed to see if you were in love or just bored." "Ethan, please!" Sarah stepped forward, her eyes filling with tears. "I made a mistake. I know that. But we've come through it. We're still standing." "I'm standing," Ethan corrected. "You're just surviving." He looked at her with an expression that hurt more than his anger ever had. It was pity. "I fired Julian. I fixed the company. I made my money back. But I realized something last night, watching you at the gala. You were looking at me with respect, Sarah. Maybe even fear, but not love. You stayed because I won, because I was the stronger horse." "That's not true," she whispered, a tear escaping. "It is," Ethan said, picking up his cardboard box. "And I don't want a wife I had to acquire in a hostile takeover. I don't want loyalty that comes from a lack of options." He nodded toward the envelope. "Those are the divorce papers. I'm not asking for much. You keep the apartment. I've already moved my things to the club. The lawyers will handle the rest." "You're leaving me?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "After everything you did to keep me?" "I didn't do it to keep you," Ethan said, walking past her toward the door. He paused, his hand on the frame, looking back one last time. "I did it to make sure that when I walked away, I was the one closing the door." "Ethan, wait!" He didn't wait. He walked out of the office, down the corridor, past the rows of employees who were now someone else's problem. The elevator doors opened, and he stepped inside without looking back. Sarah stood alone in the office of the man she had betrayed, surrounded by the empire he had built and dismantled in a matter of weeks. She looked at the envelope. She looked at the empty chair. Outside, the city roared on, indifferent to her silence. She had kept her career. She had kept the penthouse. She had won the game of survival. But as she sank into the leather chair that still held the warmth of his body, Sarah realized she was the poorest woman in New York.